So please go ahead.
Okay. So, okay. So thank you very much, Vimal, and Dr. Deshmukh and Dr. Bhaskar for this opportunity. And I'm going to be talking about tectonic evolution of the Himalayan wedge through time. So there are several issues, that date back to the 1980s on the Himalaya. And what I'll try to do is basically take you through, how the concepts have evolved and what is the contemporary understanding that we have, in terms of an international kind of understanding. So as you all know, the Indian plate basically moved to the north because of extension in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so there's an extensional boundary there. And so gradually the Indian plate moved due to this extension. And then could you please turn off your mics, if you don't mind? Yeah. So, and then once, there was an ocean, which was the Tethys Ocean between India and Asia. And then eventually that ocean kind of got closed in as India collided with Asia. So even today, we have this extensional boundary. And then you have this compressional boundary. Okay, so given that, so the end result was the Himalayan arc, which looks like so. Okay, and you can almost fit a perfect arc to this, which has a radius approximately 1,700 kilometers and has a center at the northern edge of the Tibet Plateau. So all of this is Tibet Plateau. This is your Shillong Plateau. This is the Indo-Burmese range. This is Himalaya. This is the Salt Range in Pakistan. Okay, so the Himalayan boundary is essentially from this bend in the topography, which is called the syntaxis, from here all the way to here. Okay, so this is your Namcha Barua, and this is, you are in Kashmir, or the Hazara syntaxis. So the first question, we'll talk about is, we had this controversy about what was the nature of the Himalayan boundary. Okay, so very early on in the 1980s, the Himalayan boundary was thought to be similar to what you see in the Rocky Mountains in the US, wherein, in the US and Canada here exactly. And this part you can actually see in the US. And what people saw was that there were reverse faults, okay, which were approximately 45 degrees dip, okay, and then because of the reverse faulting, you basically got the mountains forming. Okay, so this was one type, which was called the laramide type, and it was also called thick-skinned because it involved basement rocks. So the red stuff here is called the basement, and on top of the basement, usually you get sedimentary rocks, which are essentially given by these layers here. Okay, so you basically had reverse faults, okay, which were moderately dipping, uplifting basement as well as sedimentary rocks to form these laramide uplift, which basically formed Rocky Mountains. So this idea was translated to the Indian Himalayan geology. And so early sections, you can see this is from 1979, this is from 1983, basically mimicked the laramide type compressional orogenic belt, which I just showed you. Okay, and this was in the early 1980s. So when I actually came back from the US, I found that most of the people who were actually working on Himalayan geology actually had this idea that Himalaya worked similar to the laramide type orogenic belt or the mountain. So also, in late 80s, this kind of continued. There were ideas. So you had main central thrust, you have the suture, and then you had several thrusts, okay, which we actually recognize even here. Could you please turn off your mic? Okay, so these are reverse faults. You can see that they are not going and meeting any, fault at the bottom of this. Okay, so you basically have faults that are dipping to the north and not meeting any other faults. They're very discrete. Okay, so that was the essential idea of this kind of tectonics. And then the other kind of idea that we have is that all these faults actually go and meet a basal fault, which is called the detachment, okay, which is the basal detachment of any mountain belt. And this is also called a decollement, okay, if you read the literature. And that's also seen in the Cordilleran Mountains, which is west of the Rocky Mountains, which are here, okay, in Western United States. So there were sections, again, this is 1991. This was probably the first section on this thin skin style of tectonics, where basically you had a fault or the decollement that was separating basement, which is in cross here, and the sedimentary section, which is this layering. Okay, so there was this controversy where there was a bunch of people who believed that the Himalaya was thick-skinned, and there were also people who believed that there was a decollement or the detachment at the base of Himalaya, and it was thin-skinned. And the reason this thin-skin terminology is used is this detachment typically develops at the basin and sedimentary, at the basement and sedimentary boundary, like so. Okay, so only the top is getting actually deformed. Okay, below this there is very little deformation. So this is again a section from eastern Nepal, and then these ideas also started appearing in the Indian Himalayan literature. There's a paper by Thakur in 1993 where you can actually see these ideas coming into cross sections of the Himalaya. Okay, so so the idea was that we have a basal detachment in the Himalaya, and some people believe that we don't. Okay, so this was the controversy. And then in 1994, Praveen Srivastav, he actually made 2 cross sections in the northwestern Himalaya following the thin skin style, where he also had a decollement joint up. But then, of course, this was these cross sections were kind of accepted as one of the 2 possible scenarios. And so what you really needed was essentially a geophysical study to clarify this. But no matter what happens, you have some broad faults in the Himalaya. We start from the south, which is main frontal thrust, main boundary thrust, the Ramgarh thrust, main central thrust, and then you have the Tibetan, your Tibetan Golden Thrust belt. Okay, mountains. So you have these settings, whether it was thick-skinned or thin-skinned. We'll get into this a little more. But in 1996, a survey was done, a deep seismic survey was done all the way from Tibet into part of Himalaya, northern Sikkim Himalaya. And there they could image the, the basal decollement. Okay. So from geophysical data, which actually...
Professor Malay, you have the control to mute all. Can you please mute all? Because you are the host. You can mute all, and after you talk, you unmute. All the other participants, you can mute, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where is the control?
Devinder, can you just intervene? We will edit this video, no problem. Devinder?
Maybe he can do that.
Actually, you have the control now because you are the host.
So I don't see where I can do that. I'm not very familiar with Zoom because we don't use this a whole lot.
Always ऑडिबल आप ना प्रोफेसर साहब को बता दो कैसे म्यूट करना है।
यस सर, मैंने इनको मैसेज किया सर सभी को, मैं भी दोबारा से कर देता हूं सर, क्योंकि बाकी का तो ऑटोमेटिक हो गया सर। कुछ 3 या 4 पार्टिसिपेंट्स हैं ऐसे जिनका म्यूट नहीं हो पा रहा सर।
अच्छा अच्छा, काइंडली दोस हु आर द माइक ऑन प्लीज। So I think I hope disturbance. We'll edit this part. No problem. You can carry on, sir.
So you can hear me, right? I'm not muted.
Yes, sir. I can hear.
To continue with the story, we, through geophysical imaging, the main, so in 1996, the decollement, the detachment was actually, imaged through geophysical means, and then we got into, this idea that the Himalaya had a basal detachment, and that was called the Main Himalayan thrust. And so then we have a situation where you have the Indian lithosphere and the crust, okay, which is essentially underlying the Tibetan crust, and you have this zone here, which is a wedge-shaped zone, which is essentially where the Himalayan deformation is going. So now once we've established that we have a wedge-shaped zone where the base is the decollement, and and then you have the rest of the Himalayan mountain belt in this wedge-shaped body, then we can take this and understand what goes on inside this wedge, just in terms of how a bulldozer actually pushes dirt. Okay, so if you've noticed, people who are in the hills, next time there's a landslide and the bulldozer is actually starting to, push the dirt, what you will see is that the dirt doesn't actually start to move straight away. What it does, it actually builds a wedge-shaped geometry before it actually starts deforming internally. Okay, before your entire dirt starts moving along the road. Okay, so similar thing happens in the Himalaya, and that's the reason why you actually get a wedge-shaped body if you have a detachment basically develop. Okay, so where does this wedge-shaped body actually start? It starts, within,
oh goodness.
this actually.
iPhone is there.
Can you please mute your thing, Sheetal? Okay, so within this, this wedge is below the water level within the ocean to begin with. Okay, so this is the Tethys Ocean. So this wedge essentially is the material that comes off your the continent and gets deposited here, and it starts to get deformed. Okay, and then eventually, as the collision progresses, the boundary basically rises up. So you have the ocean sitting here, and then you have a wedge on one side, which is the Asian side here, and then you have the wedge on the Indian side here. And as the ocean basically closes in, these two wedges merge, and eventually they essentially form, collision zone in the form which we see today in the Himalayas. Okay, so essentially everything starts with a wedge-shaped geometry and ends up in a wedge-shaped geometry. Okay, so if you take this analogy and also take into account that we have basal detachment or decollement imaged in the Himalaya, then if you take a cross section across the Himalaya anywhere from this point, which is basically the boundary between the two plates, which existed there earlier, and basically look at this zone, then you'll essentially see something like this. And this is again diagram which was done by Vimal, the student. So that's the frontal part. That's the Indo-Gangetic plain. That's the Tethyan of your Tibetan Himalaya. These are all the high peaks. Okay, so you have higher Himalaya, and then here is the essentially main Himalayan thrust, which basically comes near surface as the main frontal thrust. Okay, and so if you take a cross section in the Himalaya, that's what it looks like. So if you look at this shape, then this entire shape is again a wedge-shaped geometry. Okay, so that's what's deforming in the Himalaya. So then, to answer the question, what is the nature of the Himalayan boundary? Okay, it's wedge-shaped with the basal detachment, which is also called the Himalayan decollement, and that's actually known as the main Himalayan thrust. And the transfer of slip. Okay, so basically here slip gets transferred all the way from back. So there is translation along this fault. Okay, there's motion along this fault of the material that sits on top of it from back all the way to the front. Okay, and that transfer of slip from north to south along the main Himalayan thrust is the key basically to understanding the Himalayan tectonics through time. And the main Himalayan thrust is also the key to understanding Himalayan earthquakes. So that's important in terms of Himalayan earthquakes. So we need to understand. So then the question arises, what is the nature of deformation in the Himalayan wedge? Okay, and that's basically my title, which is Tectonic Evolution of the Himalayan Wedge. Okay, so now if you look at deformation in space and keep time constant, then the Himalayan deformation actually gets manifested into different scales. Okay, and you can actually, have a full semester course on each of these scales. What I'm going to do today is essentially only concentrate on, this scale where we are looking at plate boundary issues, which is in hundreds of kilometers. And this diagram here basically tells you the story of, elephant and the blind men. So what the point I'm trying to make here is, unless you understand the mountain belt at every different scale, you will only have a very partial understanding of what it involves. So you need to look at, plate tectonic scale, which is typically geophysics, and the tens of kilometers and 1 kilometer scale, which is typically structural geology. And then at the scale we are talking about today is essentially an integrated scale. Okay, so now that we accept that we have a basal decollement and the material that is deforming is wedge-shaped, we can simplify the whole problem in terms of how a wedge behaves. So it has essentially two components. One is the decollement slope, that is basically this angle. What is this angle with respect to the horizontal? And then it has a topographic slope, which is essentially what is this angle with respect to the horizontal again, which is the upper slope, and this is essentially the detachment slope. Okay, so now this is also acted upon by climate. So you have an erosion component, which is basically removing material from the top. So the topographic slope actually is getting affected by your erosion. Okay, so erosion essentially erodes material, so it makes things peneplane. So this alpha slope in response to erosion. The beta slope basically remains more or less constant unless something happens, at a lower level along the detachment, which causes this to change. And there's a parameter that is defined called taper, which is alpha plus beta. Okay, so the idea is that when you have a critical angle alpha plus beta or critical taper, which is theta, then the entire material can actually move along the basal decollement. Okay, and that needs the wedge to develop that critical slope, like in the bulldozer, where once it actually reached a critical slope, you could move the material along the road. Okay, so similarly, you need to reach a critical taper, okay, so that the entire material can move along this basal detachment. And then, so after the first motion occurs, you'll get one fault. And then, of course, erosion will start to act on this. And then again, it has to go back and attain that slope, because erosion has removed or decreased the topographic slope. And then when it happens for the second time, you get a second fault. The wedge actually lengthens. Okay, it comes here. And the first fault, which was there, actually gets rotated and becomes dormant. Okay, and then gradually, if this process continues, you get a third fault, and this becomes dormant, and this actually kind of becomes extinct. Okay, so if you zoom in into this wedge, then you start developing, different what are called thrust sheets. Okay, so then in step one, you got one fault. You had 100 meters of displacement. In step two, you had 2, and then in step 3, you had 3. Okay, so you keep accumulating displacement that way. And so each of these faults are, formed in that way. And the sequence is, as you go back into the mountain towards the north in the Himalaya, they are older, and these keep getting rotated and modified as the younger ones form. Okay, now to look at the Himalayan wedge, there are 3 main components. Okay, so number one here is, the higher Himalayas, which have basement gneisses, which are very strong in terms of strength. Then you have intermediate strength sediments in the lesser Himalayas, and these are separated by essentially what is broadly called the main central thrust. And then in front here, you have the main boundary thrust, and you have schiolics, okay, which are formed. Notice that the topography is steepest here, and the basal decollement is also steepest here. So there is variation in beta, which is the basal slope, as well as the topographic slope. Okay, so if you combine the two, then there is variation in the wedge taper also along the length of the Himalayan wedge in most of the Himalayas. Here's an example of the main central thrust in the Sikkim Himalaya. Most of us who have been there recognize this as the Tare Beer, and that's actually formed because of the main central thrust. Okay, so these thrusts, which are formed, in the very early on, when they actually form, they form because of the material contrast. There is weak material this side and strong material this side. They tend to form cliffs, and if the cliffs become very steep, then you can also get landslides along this. So that's an example of one of these main faults. Okay, now what does erosion do? Erosion, like I pointed out, it removes the material. So to mass balance that, there is a material flux here. And when that happens, material that is already in the wedge kind of gets uplifted very, very quickly. Okay, and one of the ways that you can do that is by forming what is called a duplex. And if you noticed, I have this term here. So in the Darjeeling Himalaya, Sikkim Himalaya, or the Namchi area is basically where the Himalayan duplex basically is formed. Okay, so this essentially causes uplift of the material that is sitting here, and so the mass balance is done, and so once that is done, the effect of erosion is actually compensated, and the wedge again becomes your critical, and then again you can get a different form. Okay, and then of course, if the erosion starts to dominate, then the problem you'll have is you'll actually get complicated tectonics, and so again, to mass balance that, you form duplexes, which are basically volumes of rock which are surrounded by faults, and they actually build like just like a vertical building, and basically gain topography. Okay, you can also get back thrusting, which is again gains topography to compensate for the loss in alpha. Okay, and so one of the earliest reports of a duplex in the Himalaya was by Praveen Srivastav, and he actually did not see this duplex exposed in the field, but in trying to mass balance, he needed to put in this structure to make sure that it restored to its original form best. okay, which is called balancing if you are in structural geology. And so this structure is typically formed when the wedge needs to build, taper, and again, just like the bulldozer, the dirt needs to move forward. Okay, and you see the structure everywhere. You see in Kumaon Garhwal in Western Himalaya. You see in Nepal. In Nepal, it's actually breached on the surface. Okay, so what Praveen had, basically thought conceptually turned out to be true. There's evidence of that. Similarly, in Bhutan, you see the same kind of structure. The geometries are different. And the most complex geometry of this is basically seen in Sikkim Himalaya. Okay, so that's the Namche area. And right in the front of that, you see the Rangit River. Okay, that's about here for people who are familiar in that part of the Himalaya. So if you look at the Darjeeling Sikkim Himalayan wedge, it looks similar to this. If I combine, the results which were obtained in 1996 with, all the work that has been done there. So you have the lesser Himalayan duplex, and you have a structure called the Kangmar dome, which is, a fold or a bend in, the lithosphere of scale of or an amplitude of almost 100 kilometers. And that sits at the back end of the Sikkim Himalaya. Okay, this was imaged again geophysically, and that seems to be driving the Sikkim Himalayan tectonics the most. So if you apply the critical wedge theory to this Darjeeling Sikkim Himalaya, there are two dominant structures that you can see here. One is this Kangmar anticline or Kangmar dome, which I talked about, and the other is a lesser Himalayan duplex, which is actually in the Sikkim Himalaya. So these dominant structures actually drive the deformation in the wedge. So the way it turns out that the Kangmar anticline, through work by the Chinese and the Americans, this Kangmar anticline was in place by approximately 11 million years. And the main central thrust, which is this, was in place by approximately 10 million years too. And the Ramgarh thrust, which is this one, was also in place around 12 to 15 million years. Okay, but that's in Nepal. We don't have dates in the Darjeeling Himalaya. So essentially, this established the deformation in wedge was driven by the Kangmar anticline till about 10 million years. Okay, post 10 million years. Oops. Okay, so post 10 million years, the lesser Himalayan duplex, or LHD in short, seems to be the structure which is driving the mountain belt forward. Okay. Do we have data on that? Yes, we kind of have data on this, but we don't have any chronology on this, that when exactly it was then placed. Okay. So right now we only have indirect evidence, but looks like after 10 million years, this was driven by the lesser Himalayan duplex. Now in central Nepal, of course, this work has been carried out, and again, 10 million years is basically where the Ramgarh thrust was essentially in place. And then after that, you have the lesser Himalayan duplex, and you basically had several of these thrusts. So if you look at this diagram, what it tells you, the green are the main thrusts in the Himalaya. Okay, so the oldest was in the Tibetan Himalaya. Then you got the STD, which is here. Okay, then you got the main central thrust, Ramgarh thrust, main boundary thrust, and main frontal thrust. Okay, so these have happened in a sequence which is older, the green stuff, and so because of that, that is actually also called in sequence thrusting. Okay, and then you also have these red things where basically you essentially see that these are basically between these events. Okay, so this was the point where the erosion dominated, and then you needed internal deformation for things to build, so that the wedge again became critical and continued forward. So if you look at the entire alpha and beta plot, then this is your critical line. So one was where it got critical for the first time and then had the first thrust. Then it got subcritical. And then again, it deformed here so that it could reach the critical line. But then, it need not stop here. It basically went up to supercritical stage. And then again, it lost taper, reached criticality, came back subcritical, supercritical, and kept touching the critical line. So this is the way the mountain belt actually evolves. Okay, and as the mountain belt evolves like that, the strength of the décollement also gradually decreases. So ultimately, when it will have no more strength, it will basically collapse. Okay, this cycle will stop. So in this case, what happens is we have two situations. One where you basically have new faults breaking through outside the wedge. Okay, those are 1, 3, 5, 7. And then there are 2, 4, 6 where deformation within the wedge occurs so that you reach criticality. So that's the way overall Himalayan mountain belt is supposed to behave. And so you can split the entire wedge behavior into 3 parts. The part where erosion dominates, it is subcritical, okay, where you basically see the internal wedge deforming, okay, and you see faults which are not in sequence. Okay, the in sequence faults would basically lengthen the wedge. These are happening within the wedge, so that basically makes it out of sequence. Okay, or after the main faults have, or in between the main faults that have formed. Then you have a critical stage where it's exactly moving like the dirt along the bulldozer. Bulldozer pushes the dirt along the road. And then you have the third stage where essentially your wedge is lengthening and becoming longer and you're breaking new faults. Okay, so when this occurs, basically erosion is dominating the deformation. When this occurs, deformation is dominating the erosion. Okay. Now, this typically, when this occurs, you get large earthquakes. When the internal deformation occurs, you basically get. Okay. So then the nature of Himalayan deformation, you have in sequence thrusts in place till longer thrust till 10 million years. After that, the LHD is dominant. And deformation is driven by dominant structures like the Kangmar antiform, and the exhumed faults largely show ductal deformation. So, no significant contribution to landslide. Okay, so essentially, when you put together all of this, there is a special paper which is by Bissell's et al. And they've summarized all these structures essentially, in your this paper. Okay. So after this, the question that we need to answer is, what is the nature of recent deformation in the Himalayan wedge? Okay, this is most relevant to earthquake and landslide hazards in the Himalayas. So we need to focus on this. Okay, so here earlier the time was actually constant. Okay, now the time is basically variable. Okay, so in addition to spatial variation, you also have temporal variation in the deformation. So what we've been talking about essentially belongs to this category where we are looking at millions of years. Okay, so in reality, of course, space and time both vary. So that makes the structure very complex. And then we have our neotectonic time scale, wherein the deformation occurs between 1,000 to 150,000 years. Then you have paleoseismology. So I don't work on this scale, so I'm not going to touch this. And then, of course, we have, as Vimal pointed out, I work in GPS, so I'll also address this time scale. So briefly, let me just talk about this. So what happens here is, in this time scale, the deformation is called neotectonics. And this is essentially driven by the out of sequence faults, which are actually there. Okay. And so timing of recent out of sequence active deformation, I'll give you an example of this. The paper again we did in Darjeeling, Himalaya. So remember that this is driven by these faults. Okay, so one of the things deformation at this stage does is it starts affecting the topography and also starts affecting river migration and things like that. Okay, so here we see which was flowing like that is basically migrating, has been migrating through time to the west. Okay, this is actually for people from the area. This is just south of Kalijhora. Okay, so Kalijhora is approximately here. You have the main boundary thrust running through that, and then you have a couple of other thrusts. So right about in this joint, the river was actually flowing like this, and progressively as the deformation occurred, that has been shifting. Okay, so this occurs due to deformation of outer sequence deformation within the wedge. Okay, at the scale of 1,000 or kilo-year scales. Okay, and there were every time the river adjusted its course, it leaves behind what is called a terrace. Okay, it's a flat ground on which you basically have deposits of river deposits. And so the highest one was approximately 11 kilo years. Then the next time the river moved was approximately 7.7, 4.4. All these are thousands or kilo years. And this is the present level of the T-star. So you can actually see how the migration has occurred. And this migration has occurred again in response to motion along outer sequence faults, which you actually can see in the field. And these were dated to approximately around 20,000 years. And in 20,000 years, this structure was active, and that has caused these terraces to form in this time. Okay, so the other thing this does is, landscape evolution. Okay, this is again an example from the Darjeeling Himalaya. Okay, and what it does, it basically affects how the frontal Himalaya looks. So this is basically Guru Bathan. And if you look at this, there are these river terraces. The river is actually running all the way here. So these were nothing but earlier river beds, which have been actually uplifted to heights which are almost half a kilometer above the present river. Okay. So if you look at this in the field, they look like this. So there's the highest terrace. This is your the main mountain front, Labha Ridge. Okay, so this is your Darjeeling Fort terrace. And again, this was at the river level at some point. Again, below that, you have the Ambiok terrace. This was also at river level at some point. And the river is actually deep down here. Okay, so these kind of things happen, the deformation, which is more recent and essentially which occurs during the kilo-year time scale. Okay, the other thing these neotectonically active faults do induce landslides. So here's an example from the Darjeeling Himalaya again. Okay, that's the Ramgarh thrust, which has been actually reactivated during this time scale. You can see a big landslide here, which looks like so in the field. There are also other landslides along the fault trace. Okay, so this is again, of relevance. This is the Kalijhora Dam for people who are familiar with that. Okay, so these are the effects that deformation along faults at this time scale does. Now, when faults actually break or are active at this time scale, they are usually near surface. Okay, so that means that they'll be all brittle, and that would actually contribute to landslides a whole lot more than ductile faults. Okay, so for example, the Tare Bhir fault is not that landslide prone as compared to the Ramgarh thrust. Although even in the Tare Bhir fault, the main central thrust, there has been reactivation. Okay, so then we go to the youngest time scale, okay, which is basically picked up in geophysics. And so if you look at the Himalayan seismicity, okay, we argued that, all of our, in sequence deformation was such that the frontalmost fault was the youngest. And progressively, as we went back into the mountain belt, it should get older. But then all the present day seismicity is actually located somewhere in the middle. Okay, so it's not actually active in the front. Okay, so that's what we get out of seismicity. And then if you look at GPS data, this is again from Nepal. What you can see is it's the middle part which is most active. This is this is your vertical velocity, and it's the horizontal velocity. So if you look at the horizontal velocity, it basically increases as you go back into the wedge, and the vertical velocity increases somewhere in the middle. Okay, if you do leveling, which basically tells you how the uplift occurs, that's also similar, follows a similar pattern. Okay, where you have the highest uplifts in the middle of the wedge. Okay, the horizontal velocity here is about 15 millimeters per year, and vertical velocity is about 7 millimeters per year. Okay, this is basically done through surveying methods. INSAR is one method, GPS is another method, leveling is another way of doing that, and they all seem to be pointing to. And so if you kind of match it with what's happening in the wedge, the part which is seismically most active, the one which I showed you earlier, that's the part which is also uplifting most. Okay, and in the in your Nepal Himalaya, that seems to be the place where the duplexing is also happening. This is Kathmandu Valley, and this is just north of that. And that's where the MCT is, or the main central thrust, or the main boundary thrust. So in between that is the duplexing. Okay, and that's the part which seems to be most active. And that, if you look at the seismicity patterns, that's the pattern which is also again the highest. Okay. So if you summarize the Nepal GPS results, what it tells you is you don't get earthquakes in the northern part, although there is a the horizontal velocities are high, okay, at the back. That is because this main Himalayan thrust is below the brittle ductal transition. Ductal means you are basically flowing, just like in our body we have muscles which basically don't break, but they just deform in shape. So that's the kind of deformation we are having here. And once you cross this transition, the rocks behave like our bones, which basically break and cannot flow. Okay, so it's the transition between this and this is where all the earthquakes are basically occurring, and that's where the uplift is occurring. Okay, so what it means is also along this part of the main Himalayan thrust, there is no friction. So things can move very, very smoothly without any resistance. But once you get into this brittle regime, you encounter friction. So in that, essentially, you have a problem that you need to overcome this friction. And that's the reason there is resistance here, there is seismicity here, there is deformation here. And it also turns out that this is the part which gets eroded most in the Himalaya. So there is also a lot of mass removal from here. So all this slip that is accumulating here is basically going in, adding the mass here and uplifting. Okay, so that is the understanding we get from Nepal Himalaya. And similar work in Darjeeling Sikkim Himalaya done by me and my students and my colleagues basically also points to similar things here. That this is the green line here basically tells you where the maximum uplift is. And you can see the horizontal velocity is a little less than Nepal, but it's comparable. Vertical velocity is almost the same. So you essentially have, in the middle, somewhere around Yadong and, Gangtok. That's the reason that is basically deforming the most. And the velocities basically taper off here and taper off to the lower side basically from this region. So if you do a similar comparison between what's happening in Darjeeling, Sikkim, and most of the Himalaya and Nepal Himalaya, that's the main central thrust right here. That's the main central thrust. So this is the aseismic part, okay, where everything is accumulating. And during the Gorkha earthquake, we had things slip here and to this extent, okay, to almost near where the MBT is. And there was another slip back in here, which actually later on has been, attributed to one of the faults in the duplex, okay, right about here. So this is the region which got activated. Notice that, the slip was transferred only up to here. Okay, so this slip continuously comes up to here, and during earthquakes, it actually reaches forward. Okay, and how much forward it will reach depends on how much energy and strain that is stored. Okay, so if you have 2 millimeters of slip for about 2,000 years, and you have enough energy, if it breaks, then this is from Kashmir Valley, it will break it as an out of sequence thrust somewhere within the wedge. Okay, it will be building topography here, and that will produce an earthquake of about 7.8. This is work from Willem. And if you have higher slip accumulation over this period of time at this rate, then you could drive this further down here. Okay, and that would generate almost a great earthquake, which is 8.5. And the largest earthquake would be basically generated when you can drive the slip all the way to the front. Okay, and that's the reason if if you talk to paleoseismologists, they go and look for earthquake signatures in the front, and if they find that, then they tell you that okay, you had a great earthquake, because it's like for the slip to reach here and deform material out here, you need a great earthquake. Okay, and so that's essentially how this thing works at your decadal scales or active tectonic scales. Okay, so this is the understanding that we have. And now if we want to take this and connect it with critical wedge theory, then this is like the bulldozer where you could move the dirt after building the taper. So it became a critical state. So whether it's supercritical or critical, you can drive the slip all the way to the front and deform the frontal part. That would definitely cause a great earthquake. Okay, so this slip along the main Himalayan thrust is basically causing or has the potential to cause your great earthquakes. If it doesn't reach all the way to the front, okay, then it will form out of sequence deformation, and that's basically building material, your topography and taper within these wedges. Okay, so that's the understanding. So this is basically a critical state where you get great earthquakes, and typically you'll get smaller earthquakes. Okay, although you could get a large earthquake if you have this intermediate step where you don't reach all the way to the front, and then you reach that you need a high energy situation. And out of sequence typically generates lower earthquakes. This was the Kathmandu magnitude approximately. So that basically didn't drive the slip a whole lot forward. Okay, so you can connect both of these and then basically use this critical wedge theory from geological all the way to GPS scales. Okay, so in conclusion, Himalaya is a wedge-shaped boundary, follows critical wedge theory at different time scales. In sequence faults, they drive great earthquakes. Out of sequence faults drive landslides. And so we need to keep these in mind when we are developing infrastructure in the Himalaya. Okay. And thank you for the privilege of your time. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay, now floor is open for discussion. Anybody has got any questions, please raise your hand, or you can ask in the chat box. So we have got the first question from Arko Prabha. So he says that there is a difference in the structural architecture if we move from west to east. What exactly is causing the wedge to evolve differently along strike? And what control does the lithological composition of the wedge have on its evolution?
now, I can give a full, lecture on this question. Okay, and I didn't touch upon this because, of the time pressure. Now, what essentially happens is, the whole geometry of what is deforming in the Himalaya is not constant. Okay, so you get variations in basically the basement structure. You get variations in the sedimentary deposits which are on the basement. So what will eventually happen is you would get different parts of the Himalaya essentially deform differently, and wherever you have discontinuity in the deformation, you basically get some either lateral ramps or you get transverse faults, and we see all those things there too. Okay, so essentially, if I just had to frame it in one sentence, it's the material property contrast that you get across the Himalaya, okay, which is essentially reflected by the rocks, and the structure, the pre-existing structure that goes into the Himalayas. Okay, that's the short answer to your question. But to talk in terms of detailed discussion on that, I can give another talk. Okay.
Okay. Anybody else has got any
Yes.
question?
I have a question.
Yeah, Vijay.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Malay. It was a very conclusive, the speech. Thing is, I'm not from a geological background, but I work more on geothermal actually. And recently, we've been focused a lot in the Himalayan region, more in the northwestern Himalayan region. So.
Okay.
Yes, I would like to ask few questions with respect to more to the structure geology of this region. So
Okay.
I don't know if you are aware of this Kinnaur and the other region, right? Kinnaur, it's in Himachal Pradesh. Kinnaur, then to Spiti.
I'm aware of that. I've been there.
Yes. Okay.
But, I don't know the geology in this term very well. Okay.
Okay, but thing is, you see, I'm an engineer, but the best thing which I was able to conclude from your lecture, you showed a picture from Sikkim where you showed this MCT and there was a lot of this landslide. This is something I also saw in the Kinnaur region, and basically, if I was trying to confirm with the map, I could see this MCT passing through the area actually. So that was a good conclusion for me. But what I would like to know is that, Professor, do we have normal faults in this area? Do we get normal faults?
Okay, so let me just go back to this diagram. Okay, I didn't talk about it in detail here. Okay, but when you get into this supercritical wedge, situation, the wedge actually needs to lose taper. So here you actually need to gain taper to become critical. Here, you need to lose taper to become critical. And one of the mechanisms by which you can actually lose taper is normal fault.
Okay.
So if you go to the back end of, the Himalayan wedge, from STD northwards, you actually get normal faulting.
Okay.
So you might be just touching this normal faulting, field.
Okay. And if just also simple question. If I would like to, let's say I would like to map, like I would like to find a thrust area in the boundary in some area. Is it like a big zone, or is like you can clearly see the like on the surface, like for a layman like me, basically,
Well, that's actually a good question. And again, fault zone architecture is not a simple thing. You don't get a very straightforward plane. What you get is the zone, and that zone has a very systematic architecture. And so this little line, whatever I've drawn here, could be as thick as as a kilometer and larger.
Okay, and yes. Okay, and my last question. You said most of the earthquakes, they are more focused on this near to this MCT actually in the middle of the area, right? Especially as you see from the seismic measurements, if I was correct. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So what's the reason behind it? Why is it related to the beneath layer? Is it related to the magmatic movement or something?
I just gave you the reason during the talk that what happens is this part of the main Himalayan thrust is flowing. Okay, it's not breaking. So what happens is there's no friction here. So the slip can actually transfer very easily all the way till here. But here you basically cross over the transition between flow and drain. Okay,
Yeah,
so
okay.
for the first
Okay.
time, it encounters resistance here. And that's the,
Okay.
it has to actually overcome this resistance to go forward. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
That's so these earthquakes are basically defining the brittle ductile transition, in the wedge.
Okay.
All of
Okay.
these earthquakes.
Okay.
So of
Maybe
course, you can see that this is also variable.
Okay.
But by and large, this basically defines the brittle ductile transition, where the slip is coming and storing.
Okay. Maybe I will take one more last opportunity. You showed in the when this you were showing this subduction. Do we have this evidence of this volcanic eruption from the past stage in our area, basically in the Himalayan region, or is it more to the Tibetan side? Is it available in our area, basically like above MCT and yeah?
It's all north of STD, and actually it is between MCT and STD. There is evidence of your granitic activity. Okay. So granites have formed here, and that also leads to another concept that that part was probably there was a ductile channel that was essentially operating there. Okay. So there is evidence of your short answer is yes. There is evidence of past volcanism all over the Himalaya. Okay. And so much so that you also have evidence of igneous rocks in the lesser Himalaya. Okay, even out here, but that is pre-Himalayan.
Okay, maybe something I can give you a hint from my side, because as a geothermal guy from geothermal, thing is when you see the geothermal resources on the higher area, let's say like in Ladakh and maybe to the higher Kinnaur area, you see fluid has some magmatic origin actually. So you see certain composition in fluid.
Yeah, let me again take you to this diagram once.
Yes.
So you can see here that most of Tibet and a part of what you see in the higher Himalaya is actually partially molten.
Okay.
So this actually is basically the upper crust that is molten, and that is sitting all the way here. So if you're it's way anywhere close to this, it's going to get hotter.
Okay, and that's why it's unfortunate that in the Tibet area there are high temperature geothermal resources than compared to what we have on our side.
This is one of the main reasons of that.
Okay.
Apart from the usual, you have inside and becomes hot due to geothermal gradient and all that. This is one of the main things that are driving that.
Okay. In case I have more queries, would we be happy to respond? I can send.
No problem.
Yeah, I will just email to you. I really appreciate it. Okay.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Vijay. Anyone else has got any question?
Hello.
Yeah, please.
Hello, sir. My name is Shubham. I'm from Shimla. I'm teaching undergraduate students in the college geology. Sir, my question is that you talked about MHT basically, and in the region above the MHT there are certain reports there are swarms of earthquake present in that area. So somewhere I also read that in the areas above MHT there is a high fluid flow also. Sir, I was not able to conclude, but they are trying to say by high fluid flow in the areas above MHT.
In which part? The frontal part or the back part?
In the back part, in the northward side of the MHT. Okay,
so here there are several issues. Number one, I just pointed out that there is a partially molten layer. Okay, so there is a hypothesis that because you have a lot of erosion going on here in this part, so there is a lot of mass basically being lost here. To compensate for that, there is a channel that flows into this area between MCT and the South Tibet detachment and tries to compensate that mass. Okay, so if you have a ductile channel flowing, above this, then of course there'll be a lot of fluid activity. There'll be a lot of hot fluids in here. Okay, and you can actually see that if you go to the higher Himalayas. But there's also this controversy is whether it was partial melting within this or there is actually a ductile channel coming into it. Okay, but what you see is definitely there are evidences of patches of molten material. Okay, so that is very broadly called channel flow hypothesis. Okay, and one of the things that people have actually worried about is whether the critical wedge theory works or whether the channel flow works. Okay, so here if you read Pete's paper, if you look at this, critical wedge theory drives this. Okay, so if there is channel flow would be between this and this. Okay, but if channel flow was such that it would actually stop the whole conveyor belt of your Himalayan wedge, then you would not get these in sequence thrusts subsequently. Okay, it would stop. But there is evidence that this whole process has basically continued, unabated. So even if there was a channel, okay, it was operating within the large realm or large control of your critical wedge theory. Okay, and in fact there are papers which say that this out of sequence deformation was known to structural geologists much before it became famous in the Himalaya. Okay, it's part of any mountain belt you go and see. But it became famous in the Himalaya because there was this hypothesis that out of sequence deformation in the Himalaya was actually controlled only by channel flow. Okay, so so to answer your question, the fluid activity is basically related to this channel, okay, between MCT and ST. Okay, and we see that we don't know whether there was a channel actually in operation, but we do know that there is material that is molten here and solidified after that. So that means there were lots of fluids in it. Okay, so maybe that's what you're referring to.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Okay.
Ankur Srivastava ji.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for your presentation, and it was very nice. So I have one question regarding the river migration, and so since I am also working on the ecohydro geomorphic implications of hill slope aspect in the various topographic mountains, so I would like to ask, if we have generally the vegetation over the topographic mountains, so how important is the role of the vegetation dynamics? For example, if we have a bare soil on both the topographies on the windward and leeward side due to the orographic, so we can have the erosion obviously on the windward side more. So the the divide migration that can take place, it can be certainly towards the leeward side. But I would like to ask, when we have a vegetation over there, so which control or which factor will dominate more, whether it will be the erosion because of the precipitation or the vegetation dynamics, will there be a competition between those two, or it will be a certain, when we will have more precipitation, we will have higher erosion on the vegetation or the windward side?
So when you're talking about erosion, okay, so basically, just like the slide is pointing, there are two issues. Number one is erosion, which is climate driven, and the other one is deformation, which is tectonics driven. Okay, and they are kind of coupled because erosion, what it does, it removes mass. Okay, it changes the mass balance of the wedge, and deformation tries to fill it. Okay, now, so what you're talking about is the factors that drive erosion. Okay, so if you don't have vegetation and you have, for example, if you are in a fault zone, if you are in terrain like this, okay, so if you are in a terrain like this, right? If you are in a fault zone and where there is very little vegetation, you can see here, right? So then obviously erosion will be enhanced here. Okay, so if erosion is enhanced, more mass will be lost. Okay, you can also have a situation where where it's only a part of the wedge where the erosion is removing material from. Okay, that's also called focused erosion. Okay, so all that erosion and the factors that control erosion basically make a climatic contribution to this problem. Okay, so how much mass is being wasted? Okay, how much mass is being removed from the wedge? Okay, if you have a vegetated area, obviously the erosions are less, erosion rates are less. Okay, less mass will be eroded. Okay, so that basically helps reduce the mass that is taken away by erosion. Okay, if you don't have vegetation, erosion will be higher. If erosion is, if you have completely barren things like you have in Spiti Valley and things like that, then erosion rates will obviously be high compared to terrain which is like this. Okay, but what happens due to erosion eventually? Is it significant enough that the mass that has been lost needs to be filled up by deformation? That's the key question. Okay, so as long as it is not very significant, it doesn't matter. But if it starts becoming significant that you actually need deformation to basically fill in that mass, then you need to worry about it. Okay,
sure, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, on the similar lines, Shivashish has got a question. He asks that, is the time scale on which the strength of the monsoon fluctuates relevant to the evolution of the wedge? And how sensitive is the wedge to the strength of monsoon?
Again,
yeah,
the monsoon just got here, so you can probably hear, lots of rain and thunder in the background. Okay, anyway, so the key question is, look, erosion versus tectonics. Okay, so the time scale when you're looking at, it's basically represented by what I actually showed you. Okay, so that seems to be the time scale at which things are in operation. Okay, so it's typically a millionaire year time scale at which this wedge basically cycles through things. Okay, now within this cycle you can have subcycles. That's also relevant. And then for some reason, if monsoon is enhanced and erosion is enhanced, okay, so monsoon part and erosion part is coupled to the climate part. So if there is variability in that, okay, then of course it will affect the typical cycle that the wedge is going through. Okay, so in that sense, yes, it is sensitive to variations in the monsoon, but then more than variations in the monsoon, I would say it is sensitive to how much material is actually being eventually lost. So you can also get a situation by, say, you're removing material like this in a very focused erosion here. Then that would trigger deformation, to fill up that mass loss. Okay, but if you look at overall, time scales, it basically cycles through in million-year time scales. Okay, does that answer your question?
I hope that answers Shivashish's question. It's all the scale that we are basically looking at. So I think it's 8:15 and we should actually.
Can I ask one question?
Naresh ji.
Yeah, sir, I'm Naresh Rana from Delhi University, and I just wanted to know how do you see the normal sense of faulting along STD? I mean, is it was it developed in a similar way like the MCT and the other faults were developed, or it was developed in the later stage? And how do you, I mean, I have seen one of your paper where you have given some idea about the activity along STD. So can you explain it a little bit?
If you actually go and look at, the South Tibet detachment in the field, I've gone and seen it in the Darjeeling Himalaya, very close to Guru Tungmar Lake, actually, at Guru Tungmar Lake. So what you see there is it had an earlier compressional history. Okay, so you see both top to the south and top to the north motions. So earlier it was a thrust fault that has been reactivated as basically a normal fault. Okay, and that more or less is the large southern boundary beyond which to the north you get even normal earthquakes. You don't get normal earthquakes south of that. Okay.
It was the first.
So it was a thrust to begin with, yes.
Yeah, the first thrust, yeah, right? The first one.
Yes. So first was thrust, and then that was reactivated as a normal fault.
So is it active still?
I'm not completely sure,
I mean,
but one of my students actually worked on the STD, and what he saw was there were brittle parts of the fault. Okay, now if there were brittle parts of that, that means it has been getting reactivated. But he hasn't actually done a chronology on it to actually figure out when it was getting reactivated. Okay, but there are brittle parts of that fault.
I think I have seen one of your paper on GPS, and where you have also given some indication of activity along.
Yes. So if you go into north of that, you actually measuring extension. Okay, but that is in a very specific location in northwest Himalaya. Whether that's that's true all over the Himalaya or not, I don't have the data to say that. But if I had to take a wild guess, I would say yes, there is extension, which is activity because you are getting normal earthquakes. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. It was from Malari area, I guess, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just in continuation, because I'm glad that Naresh asked that question, because I had the same question I wanted to ask. The nature of STD changed from reverse to normal. Has that anything to do with the movement on MCT?
Well, see, the one of the hypotheses is that if there is a ductal channel, if there's a channel, then you'll get compression on one side and extension on the other side, and that's one of the main reasons or main evidences that supports channel flow, because STD being its northern boundary, it is slipping in a normal manner, and the southern boundary is your MCT, which is slipping in a reverse manner. So that basically is consistent with a ductal channel. Okay. So that is one of the reasons, one of the evidences to support channel flow. Now, if it is happening because of that, or it is just because you just have an extensional faulting regime north of that, that is anybody's guess. Nobody's actually worked on this specific problem, to the best of my knowledge.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think it's time we close now. It's 8:17. So I invite Professor Deshmukh to present vote of thanks. Thank you very much, sir, once again for an excellent talk.
Thank you, Vimal, and thank you, everyone. And,
thank you, Malayji. Very interesting and lot of questions. It is, I think, served the purpose. You have ignited the minds, and I share this video in all the media wherever possible.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, Deshmukh ji, please.
Yes.
Sir, respected members, on behalf of the Geological Society of India, Delhi chapter, and my own personal behalf, I express my deep sense of gratitude to today's speaker, Professor Malay Mukul from IIT Mumbai, for his kind consent and sparing his valuable time to deliver this excellent and stimulating talk on this very interesting topic. We sincerely thank Professor Harsh Gupta, President, Geological Society of India, for his encouragement, and also the council members who were present today for gracing the occasion and encouragement. We would like to convey our gratitude to Professor R. Bhaskar, President, Geological Society of India, Delhi chapter, for his guidance, keen interest, and involvement in the activities of the society, and his energy keeps us motivated. Thanks are also due to Secretary of the Society, Professor Midan Mishra, ma'am, for her encouragement, and also to all the other elected office bearers for their support and encouragement. Efforts of Dr. Devinder for making this beautiful poster and hosting and recording today's talk is much appreciated.
Deshmukh ji, you are muted.
For sparing their time and participating in this talk and making it a success. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all my esteemed colleagues of the discipline of Geology, School of Sciences, IGNOU. We are thankful to all the members for their cooperation and assistance in arranging today's talk. Thank you so much for being with us. With your permission, now we can conclude this talk. Thank you and have a nice time.
Thank you all. Thank you,
Thank you, sir.
Deshmukh ji, and thank you, Vimal Singh. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mukul
Bye,
ji.
sir.
Thank you.